the light that never went out, the last keeper of the Scottish Isles. Welcome to Mystic Sleep Tales. I'm so glad you're here with us tonight, settling in for a journey through one of Scotland's most enduring mysteries and the remarkable people who dedicated their lives to keeping the lights burning along the country's treacherous coasts. Tonight, we're exploring the world of Scottish lighthouse keepers, a vanished profession that bridged centuries of tradition before finally fading into history just over 2 decades ago. Whether you're drifting off to sleep or simply curious about the men and women who stood watch over Scotland's darkest waters, this story is for you. So get comfortable, let your mind wander to windswept islands and crashing waves, and let's begin. The edge of everything. Picture the Scottish coastline in your mind. Not the gentle beaches of tourist postcards, but the real Scotland, the one that sailors have feared for 1,000 years. Jagged cliffs rising straight from boiling seas. Rocks that hide just beneath the surface, waiting like teeth to tear the hull from any ship unlucky enough to pass overhead. Storms that blow in from the North Atlantic with winds strong enough to knock a grown man off his feet, waves tall enough to swallow entire fishing vessels in a single gulp. This is the Scotland that demanded lighthouses. Not wanted them, demanded them. Because before those lights existed, the waters around Scotland were a graveyard. Ships went down with such regularity that coastal communities developed an entire economy around salvaging the wreckage. Some historians estimate that in a typical winter during the late 1700s, 6 ships would wreck on a single reef. In one particularly vicious storm, 70 vessels were lost along Scotland's east coast in a single night. 70 ships. Thousands of lives snuffed out in the darkness because there was no light to warn them away from the rocks. The coastline wasn't just dangerous, it was lethal in a way that's hard for us to imagine today. These weren't accidents in the modern sense. They were inevitabilities. Sail along Scotland's shores at night, and eventually, statistically, you would hit something. The only question was when. And so, for generations, the darkness claimed its tribute in wood and canvas and human lives. And nobody could do anything about it except pray and hope their ship wouldn't be the next one to go down. But in 1786, something changed. The Northern Lighthouse Board was established, tasked with a mission that seemed almost impossibly ambitious: to light the entire Scottish coastline, to transform those deadly waters into navigable channels, to put an end to the centuries of shipwrecks and drownings that had made Scotland's seas so feared. It was the beginning of a lighthouse building boom that would last more than 100 years and would be dominated almost entirely by one family whose name became synonymous with Scottish engineering excellence: the Stevenson family. If you know anything about Scottish literature, that surname might ring a bell. Robert Louis Stevenson, the author of Treasure Island and The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, came from this family. But long before Robert Louis picked up a pen, his grandfather and great-uncles were picking up surveying equipment and heading out to the most inhospitable locations imaginable to build structures that would have to withstand the worst weather on Earth. Robert Stevenson, the patriarch of the Lighthouse dynasty, was born in Glasgow in 1772. His father died when Robert was just 2 years old, leaving his mother in difficult financial circumstances. But fortune smiled on young Robert when his mother remarried. Her new husband was Thomas Smith, an engineer who had just been appointed to work with the newly formed Northern Lighthouse Board. Robert became his stepfather's apprentice, learning the craft that would define his entire life. And what a life it would be! Over his nearly 50-year career with the Northern Lighthouse Board, Robert Stevenson would design and oversee the construction of more than a dozen major lighthouses, plus numerous smaller lights and navigational aids. He would innovate constantly, developing new reflector systems, rotating mechanisms, and construction techniques. He would become so renowned that other countries would request his designs for their own coastlines. But of all his achievements, one stands head and shoulders above the rest, both literally and figuratively. One lighthouse that represents perhaps the greatest engineering triumph of the age. The Bell Rock Lighthouse. Impossible project. 11 miles off the coast of Arbroath, in the churning waters where the North Sea meets the Firth of Tay, there lies a sandstone reef that has been the death of countless sailors. The Bell Rock, also called Inchcape Rock, though nobody quite remembers why. What everyone remembers are the ships. The endless parade of ships that hit this reef and sank, sometimes with all hands, sometimes with survivors who could only cling to the rocks and watch their vessel break apart beneath them before they too were swept away by the tide. The problem with Bell Rock was its location and its timing. The reef sits just below the surface of the water, not deep enough that ships can safely pass over it, but not tall enough that it's visible from any distance. And it's only exposed for a few hours each day at low tide. The rest of the time, it's hidden beneath up to 16 feet of water, completely invisible, a trap waiting to spring on any vessel that ventures too close. Legend says that in the 14th century, an abbot from nearby Arbroath Abbey tried to solve the problem by installing a warning bell on the rock. When the waves moved, the bell would ring, alerting sailors to the danger. It was a clever idea, and it might have worked, except that bells don't last long in the North Atlantic. The mechanism corroded, the bell fell silent, and the ships kept sinking. By the turn of the 19th century, the situation had become untenable. Local merchants, ship captains, and government officials were all clamoring for something to be done. The Northern Lighthouse Board received petition after petition, plea after plea, to build a light on Bell Rock. But the board was reluctant. The technical challenges seemed insurmountable. The reef was submerged most of the time. The currents were treacherous. The weather was consistently terrible. And most importantly, no engineer in Britain thought it could be done. Then in 1804, everything changed. HMS York, a 64-gun warship of the Royal Navy, struck Bell Rock in a storm and sank. All 491 men aboard perished. The loss of a major warship and so many naval personnel caused such an uproar in Parliament that the Northern Lighthouse Board could no longer avoid taking action. They needed someone to design and build a lighthouse on Bell Rock, and they needed that someone to start immediately. Robert Stevenson had actually proposed a design for a Bell Rock lighthouse as early as 1799, but the board had rejected it as too expensive and too risky. Now, with political pressure mounting, they dusted off his plans and took another look. The design was based on John Smeaton's Eddystone Lighthouse, which had successfully been built on another offshore reef. Stevenson's innovation was to use interlocking stones that would be fitted together with such precision that the whole structure would effectively become a single piece of stone, able to withstand the most violent storms without breaking apart. It was brilliant. It was elegant. It was also terrifying to contemplate actually building. The board gave the commission to John Rennie, Britain's most famous engineer at the time. Stevenson, despite having designed the lighthouse and having intimate knowledge of Bell Rock, was appointed merely as Rennie's assistant. It was a slight that Stevenson never quite forgave, though he was professional enough not to let it interfere with the work. And the work was unlike anything anyone had attempted before. Construction began in 1807. The plan was to build during low tide in the summer months when the rock was exposed. This meant the workers would arrive by boat, scramble onto the reef when the water receded, work frantically for a few hours while the rock was dry, then evacuate before the tide came back in and covered everything again. They were racing against the clock every single day, knowing that if they misjudged the timing, people would die. During the first season of construction, something happened that perfectly encapsulates just how dangerous this project was. The workers were on the rock, busy cutting and shaping stone, when someone looked up and realized the tide was coming in faster than expected. The boats that were supposed to ferry everyone back to the supply ship had already left, carrying a load of equipment. There weren't enough boats to evacuate everyone, and the water was rising. Panic set in. Men who couldn't swim looked at the waves lapping at their feet and understood what was about to happen. The rock was going to be submerged. They were going to be in the water. And the currents around Bell Rock were strong enough to sweep a man miles out to sea before he drowned. Robert Stevenson, who was supervising the work, tried to keep everyone calm while frantically calculating how many men could fit in the remaining boat and how many would have to stay on the rock. The math was grim. Not everyone was going to make it. They would have to choose who would try to swim for it and who would cling to the rock and hope they could hold on until the tide went out again, assuming they weren't swept away first. And then, like something out of a novel, a boat appeared on the horizon. The Bell Rock pilot boat, making its scheduled run to deliver mail to Stevenson. It arrived just in time to take the remaining men off the rock before the water rose over their heads. They were saved by pure chance by the timing of a mail delivery. If that boat had been 15 minutes later, the Bell Rock Lighthouse might never have been built because Robert Stevenson and half his crew would have drowned. But they didn't drown. They went back to work. And over the next 3 years, despite accidents, despite injuries, despite the constant threat of drowning or being swept away by a wave, they built what would become one of the engineering marvels of the age. The lighthouse took shape stone by stone, course by course. Each block had to be cut with incredible precision so it would interlock with its neighbors. The granite came from quarries on the mainland and had to be transported by boat in weather that was frequently too rough for safe passage. Workers were injured regularly. One man, John Bonnyman, a stonemason, had his finger crushed in an accident with a crane and had to have it amputated. As compensation, Stevenson appointed him as one of the first lighthouse keepers, a position that would provide steady income for the rest of his life. The construction was interrupted by winter, by storms, by equipment failures, by the simple reality that you can't build a lighthouse when the waves are 30 feet high and the wind is strong enough to knock you off your feet. But slowly, inexorably, the tower grew. By 1809, the structure had risen high enough that the top was above the high tide mark. By 1810, it was complete. The Bell Rock Lighthouse stood 75 feet tall, built from interlocking blocks of sandstone and granite, topped with a lantern room that housed a revolutionary new lighting system designed by Robert Stevenson himself. The light used rotating oil lamps placed in front of parabolic reflectors, and it was the first lighthouse anywhere to use alternating red and white flashes to give it a distinctive signature that sailors could recognize from miles away. On February 1st, 1811, the light was lit for the first time. Ships passing Bell Rock that night suddenly saw what had never been there before, a brilliant beacon warning them away from the rocks that had claimed so many vessels. The death toll in those waters began to drop immediately. The Bell Rock Lighthouse, which many had said was impossible to build, was now saving lives every single night. Robert Stevenson's masterpiece still stands today. It's still operational. It's still guiding ships safely past Bell Rock, more than 200 years after it was built. And it set the standard for everything that came after. The Stevenson family went on to design and build dozens more lighthouses around Scotland and beyond. Robert's sons Alan, David, and Thomas all became lighthouse engineers. His grandsons continued the tradition. For over 150 years, if a lighthouse was being built in Scotland, there was a very good chance a Stevenson was involved. But lighthouses are only half the story. Because a lighthouse without a keeper is just a tall building with a lamp in it. The real magic, the real mysticism of these structures came from the men who lived in them, who maintained them, who kept the light burning no matter what. The lighthouse keepers, and their story is, in many ways, even more remarkable than the buildings themselves. The keepers of the light. Imagine applying for a job and being told that you'll be expected to live in complete isolation for weeks or months at a time. That you'll be sharing cramped quarters with two other men you may or may not get along with. That you'll be exposed to violent storms that could literally kill you if you step outside at the wrong moment. That you'll work in a building surrounded by the ocean, where the walls shake during bad weather and spray from the waves reaches high enough to hit the windows of the lantern room 70 feet above sea level. And that if anything goes wrong, if you get sick or injured, help might be days away because the weather is too rough for boats to reach you. Oh, and you'll be responsible for maintaining extremely precise and delicate optical equipment, keeping detailed logs, and staying alert during night watches that last for hours. You'll have to be comfortable with heights, since you'll be climbing spiral staircases multiple times every day. And you need to be the kind of person who can handle months of boredom punctuated by moments of absolute terror when storms hit. Still interested? Because if you were, you might have been cut out to be a Scottish lighthouse keeper. The position was created out of necessity. These towers couldn't be left unmanned. The oil lamps needed constant attention. The rotating mechanisms had to be wound regularly. The lenses, some of which weighed up to 2.5 tons, had to be cleaned meticulously. The foghorns and fog signals had to be monitored and activated when visibility dropped. And most importantly, someone had to be there to keep watch, to make sure everything was functioning properly, because a lighthouse that wasn't lit wasn't just useless, it was actively dangerous. Ships would see the darkness where they expected light, and might assume they were somewhere else entirely, potentially steering themselves directly into the hazards the lighthouse was supposed to warn them about. So the Northern Lighthouse Board established a corps of lighthouse keepers, men who would dedicate their lives to this peculiar and demanding profession. At its peak in the 1890s, the board employed over 600 keepers, with a waiting list of more than 200 applicants hoping to join. Despite the hardships, despite the isolation, despite the danger, it was a sought-after position. Why? Because it offered something that was genuinely rare for working-class men in that era. Security. Lighthouse keepers received a steady salary. They got free housing, either at the lighthouse itself or in accommodation provided near shore stations. They received coal for heating, candles for light, and a clothing allowance. All repairs and maintenance on their housing were paid for by the board. They even got land where they could keep a few cows or grow vegetables, and if they didn't want to farm, they got the equivalent value in money. For a laborer or a sailor with a family to support, this was an incredible deal. You'd have reliable income, a roof over your head, and the knowledge that your children wouldn't starve if you got injured or too old to work. But you'd pay for that security with isolation and danger and a life that was, in many ways, not entirely your own. Robert Stevenson, who was not just an engineer but also a strict disciplinarian, set the tone for the lighthouse service in its early days. He introduced what he called the military habit of mind to the keepers. Regular inspections, strict regulations, a code of conduct that governed not just their work, but their personal lives as well. Keepers were expected to be sober and industrious, cleanly in their persons and linens, and orderly in their families. They had to maintain the lighthouse to exacting standards. Dust on the lantern glass? That was a firing offense. Unwashed crockery? Unacceptable. A keeper who wasn't maintaining military-level cleanliness and discipline would find himself out of a job very quickly. Stevenson would make surprise visits to the lighthouses, arriving unannounced to inspect the premises. Bella Bathurst, in her book, The Lighthouse Stevenson's, describes him as having a bloodhound's nose for trouble or dust. If he found something amiss, he would note it in his report, and consequences would follow. The keepers learned very quickly that there was no room for laziness or sloppiness in the lighthouse service. The standards were high, and they were enforced. But within those strict parameters, the keepers developed their own culture, their own traditions, their own ways of coping with the unique demands of their profession. And those demands varied enormously depending on where you were stationed. There were, broadly speaking, 3 types of lighthouse postings. Shore stations were located on the mainland or on large islands where families could live. These were the most desirable postings because they allowed a keeper to have a relatively normal home life. Yes, you'd still be working at the lighthouse, still maintaining the equipment and keeping the watch, but at least you could go home to your wife and children at the end of your shift. You could participate in the community. Your kids could go to school. It wasn't a typical existence, but it was bearable. Then there were the island stations. These are lighthouses on smaller, more remote islands. Some of them had small communities, but many were essentially deserted except for the lighthouse itself and the keepers' families. These postings meant more isolation, less access to supplies, longer periods between relief boats. But you could still bring your family, and that made all the difference psychologically. And then there were the rock stations. The rock stations were something else entirely. These were the lighthouses like Bell Rock, built on reefs in the middle of the ocean, completely surrounded by water, miles from the nearest land. There was no way to bring your family to a rock station. There was barely room for the keepers themselves. These towers were, in effect, vertical prisons, tall, thin structures rising from the waves with only a few small rooms stacked one on top of the other. Living in a rock station was like being in a submarine, except the submarine was welded to a reef and couldn't move. The accommodations were cramped beyond belief. At Bell Rock, for example, there were typically 3 keepers on duty at any time. They shared a circular room just 13 feet across. Their bunks were stacked one on top of another against the curved wall, with only a curtain for privacy. The keeper who had been on watch during the previous night would make breakfast for everyone. Then the day would be spent cleaning, maintaining the equipment, measuring supplies like oil and water, and preparing for the next night's watch. And the watches, they were brutal. At night, the keepers took turns staying in a lantern room to ensure the light was working properly. Depending on the type of mechanism, the keeper might have to wind the clockwork every 30 minutes all night long. If you were on watch from midnight to 4 in the morning, that meant winding the mechanism 8 times while trying to stay alert and make sure nothing malfunctioned. Then you try to sleep in a room where other people were moving around, eating, working, living. True rest was almost impossible. John Both, who was the principal keeper at Bell Rock for several years until its automation in 1988, described it as being like a vertical submarine. There was no fresh water except what was collected from rain or brought in by boat. There were no proper washing facilities. Both said he would bring up a bucket of seawater and pour it over his head for a bath. That was it. That was hygiene at one of the most famous lighthouses in the world. Getting on and off a rock station was its own adventure. The seas around these reefs were always rough. Boats couldn't dock, they could only get close. Keepers and supplies had to be transferred using a derrick and bosun's chair, basically a seat on a rope that would be winched up to the lighthouse or lowered down to the boat. You'd sit in this chair, exposed to the wind and spray, and hope that the person operating the winch knew what they were doing. If the boat was pitching in heavy seas, if the wind was gusting unpredictably, the transfer could be genuinely terrifying. There are accounts of keepers refusing to take postings at certain rock stations, specifically because the transfers were too dangerous. Bill Galt, who spent 5 years at Scaravore Lighthouse, described the process. You'd arrive by boat, then be attached to a pulley. Then you'd sort of climb out and be winched onto the island. As soon as you were on, it was a mission to bring the provisions in as fast as possible. Scaravore, located 12 miles southwest of the island of Tiree, is Scotland's tallest lighthouse at 156 feet. It was built by Alan Stevenson, Robert's son, between 1838 and 1844, and its construction was, if anything, even more harrowing than Bell Rock's. The reef on which Scaravore stands is fully submerged at high tide, with currents so strong and waves so violent that construction could only proceed on the calmest days. Alan Stevenson nearly died multiple times during the build. Workers were injured constantly. The project took 6 years, and when it was finished, Alan's health was so destroyed by the stress and physical toll that he never fully recovered. But Scaravore was worth it. The lighthouse has stood through storms that generated waves over 100 feet tall. During one particularly violent tempest, a wave hit the lighthouse so hard that it shook the entire structure. The keepers inside, safe behind walls of solid stone, felt the building tremble like it was going to collapse. But it held. Alan Stevenson's engineering held. The light kept burning. That was the thing about rock stations. They were terrifying to live in, especially during storms. The whole building would shake. Spray from the waves would hit windows that were 70, 80, even 100 feet above the sea. The noise was overwhelming, a constant roaring that made it impossible to sleep, impossible to think, impossible to do anything except hold on and trust that the engineers who built this tower knew what they were doing. And usually they did, but not always. The mystery of Eileen Moore. On December 15th, 1900, 3 lighthouse keepers made their final entries in the log at Flannan Isle Lighthouse. James Duckett, the principal keeper, Thomas Marshall, the second assistant, and Donald MacArthur, an occasional keeper who was filling in for a colleague on sick leave. These were experienced men, professionals who had served in the lighthouse service for years. Duckett had been with the Northern Lighthouse Board since 1878 and had been promoted to principal keeper in 1896. Marshall had 20 years of experience. MacArthur was a seasoned mariner with a reputation as a tough, capable man. The Flannan Isles are a small archipelago about 20 miles west of the Isle of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides. Remote doesn't begin to describe them. These are islands at the edge of everything, exposed to the full fury of the North Atlantic, battered by storms that roll in with monotonous regularity. The islands have always had an eerie reputation. They're named after Saint Flannan, a 6th century Irish bishop who supposedly built a chapel on one of the islands. For centuries, shepherds would bring sheep to graze on Eileen Moore, the largest island, but they refused to stay overnight. The place felt wrong to them. Haunted, some said, though nobody could quite explain what they meant by that. The lighthouse on Eileen Moore had only been operational for a little over a year. It was built between 1895 and 1899, designed by David Allen Stevenson, grandson of Robert. The structure itself was a masterpiece of engineering, 75 feet tall, positioned on cliffs 200 feet above sea level. The light had a range of 20 miles and flashed twice every 30 seconds. It should have been visible to any ship passing within that range. On December 15th, the steamer Archdor, sailing from Philadelphia to Leith, noted in its log that the Flannan Isle light was not operational. The weather was poor, visibility was terrible, and the absence of a light was troubling. When the ship docked in Leith 3 days later, the sighting was reported to the Northern Lighthouse Board. The board immediately knew something was wrong. Lighthouse keepers didn't just let the light go out. It was their primary responsibility, the entire reason the lighthouse existed. If the light wasn't lit, something serious must have happened. They dispatched the relief vessel Hesperus to investigate, but severe weather delayed the ship's departure. It wasn't until December 26th, Boxing Day, that the Hesperus finally reached Eilean More. Captain James Harvey commanded the vessel. As the ship approached the island, he sounded the horn and fired a flare, standard procedure to alert the keepers that relief had arrived. There was no response. No flag flying from the lighthouse. No figures visible on the landing. No boxes of supplies waiting to be loaded onto the ship. Nothing. The silence was unsettling. Harvey ordered a boat launched. Joseph Moore, the relief keeper who was scheduled to take over from one of the 3 men on the island, was put ashore alone. He climbed the 160 steep steps that led from the landing to the lighthouse compound, and with each step, his sense of unease grew. The entrance gate was closed. The main door was closed. When Moore pushed it open and stepped inside, he found himself in a scene that would become one of the most famous mysteries in maritime history. The lighthouse was empty, completely empty. The kitchen was tidy. The lamps had been cleaned and refilled, ready for the night's work. Everything was in its proper place, but the clock on the wall had stopped. The beds were unmade, and there was no sign whatsoever of the 3 keepers. Moore found a canary in a cage in the kitchen, the only living thing in the entire lighthouse. The bird sat quietly, apparently healthy, apparently well-fed. But the men who had been caring for it were gone. Moore hurried back to the landing to report what he'd found. Captain Harvey sent more men ashore, including the ship's second mate and several seamen. They conducted a thorough search of the lighthouse and the surrounding area. They found that only 2 sets of oilskins were missing from the entrance. The 3rd set, which belonged to MacArthur, was still hanging on its peg. This suggested that 2 of the keepers had gone outside in foul weather gear, while the 3rd had left without his waterproof coat. In December, in the Outer Hebrides, in conditions bad enough that the other 2 men had deemed it necessary to wear protection. The searchers expanded their investigation to the entire island. The East Landing, where supply boats typically docked, was intact. Nothing seemed amiss. But when they checked the West Landing, they found evidence of catastrophic damage. A storage box that had been secured 33 meters above sea level had been smashed open, its contents scattered. Iron railings along the path were bent and twisted. A section of railway track had been torn from its concrete moorings. Most remarkably, a boulder weighing more than a ton had been displaced. And at the top of the cliff, more than 60 meters above sea level, turf had been ripped away as far as 10 meters back from the edge. The evidence suggested a storm of extraordinary violence had struck the island. But when had this storm occurred? And why had experienced lighthouse keepers, safe inside a solid stone tower 150 feet above sea level, abandoned their post and ventured out into conditions violent enough to damage equipment and move boulders? The Northern Lighthouse Board launched an immediate investigation. Robert Muirhead, a superintendent who had personally recruited all 3 of the missing men, traveled to Eilean More to examine the scene. His report, filed on December 29th, concluded that the men must have been swept into the sea while trying to secure equipment or check for damage at the West Landing. It was the most logical explanation, but it raised more questions than it answered. Why would all 3 men leave the lighthouse at the same time? Regulations strictly prohibited this. There always had to be at least 1 keeper in the lighthouse to maintain the light and respond to emergencies. Who had left first? Had 1 man gone out to check the landing, then another followed when the first didn't return, and then the 3rd went looking for both of them? Or had all 3 gone together, knowingly violating protocol? And what about MacArthur's coat? Why would a seasoned mariner who knew better than anyone how deadly the Scottish winter could be venture out in just his shirt sleeves? Had he been in such a hurry that he didn't take time to grab his coat? Had he seen something so urgent that he rushed out without thinking? The weather records complicated things further. While there had definitely been storms in the area in mid-December, locals on Lewis reported that the seas should have been relatively calm around the 15th. The lighthouse was visible from Lewis on clear days, and if there had been a storm bad enough to generate the kind of damage found at the West Landing, the visibility would have been too poor to see the island at all. Then there were the rumors about the logbook. According to some accounts, the last entries in the log described increasingly strange conditions. Marshall supposedly wrote on December 12th about experiencing winds unlike anything he'd seen in 20 years, and noted that Duckett had been unusually quiet and that MacArthur had been crying. On December 13th, the entries allegedly stated that the storm was still raging and that all three men had been praying. This seemed absurd. Why would three experienced keepers, safe in a lighthouse 150 feet above sea level, be reduced to prayer by a storm? They would have weathered dozens of violent storms in their careers. What could possibly have frightened them so badly? But here's the thing. Most historians now believe those logbook entries never existed. They appear to have been fabrications, embellishments added to the story later to make it more dramatic. The official investigation found no such entries. The last recorded log entry was routine and unremarkable. The legend of the terrified keepers praying in their tower seems to have been invented sometime after the fact, perhaps by someone who thought the truth wasn't strange enough on its own. So what really happened? The most likely explanation, supported by research conducted decades later, is this. Thomas Marshall had previously been fined 5 shillings for losing equipment during a storm. 5 shillings might not sound like much, but for a working man supporting a family in 1900, it was a significant penalty. Marshall would have been desperate to avoid another fine. When he saw or heard damage being done at the West Landing, he would have wanted to secure the equipment before it was destroyed or washed away. So Marshall put on his oilskins and went out, probably bringing Duckett with him as backup. Lighthouse protocol required at least one keeper to remain in the lighthouse at all times, so MacArthur stayed behind. But then something happened at the landing. Maybe the two men were caught by a massive wave, one of those rogue waves that can appear without warning even when the seas seem relatively calm. Maybe they were swept into the ocean. MacArthur, watching from the lighthouse, would have seen his colleagues in trouble. And despite knowing he was supposed to stay inside, despite the danger, despite everything his training told him, he rushed out to help them. Without his coat, without preparation, because his friends were drowning and every second mattered. And then he too was swept away, claimed by the same forces that had taken the others. It's a theory. It fits the evidence. But it's still just a theory. Because the bodies of James Duckett, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur were never recovered. They vanished into the North Atlantic, and the ocean has kept their secret for more than 120 years. The Flannan Isle mystery has spawned countless alternative theories over the decades. Some people, looking for more dramatic explanations, have suggested everything from sea monsters to foreign spies to alien abduction. But the prosaic explanation, that 3 good men died trying to do their jobs and save their equipment, is probably the right one. And in some ways, it's the most haunting explanation of all, because it means their deaths were preventable. If Marshall hadn't been fined previously, if the storm had hit at a different time, if MacArthur had stayed in the lighthouse as he was supposed to, if the lighthouse continued operating after the tragedy, of course. New keepers were appointed. The light was maintained. Ships were guided safely past the Flannan Isles for another 70 years. But the reputation of Eilean Moore never recovered. Keepers stationed there reported strange experiences. Voices in the wind calling out names. Feelings of unease that couldn't be explained. The sense that they were being watched. Were these genuinely supernatural occurrences? Or were they just a product of isolation and knowledge of what had happened? When you're alone in a lighthouse in the middle of the ocean, knowing that 3 men disappeared from this exact spot, your imagination can run wild. Every sound becomes suspicious. Every shadow could be something more. In 1971, the Flannan Isle Lighthouse was automated. The keepers left for the last time, and the building was sealed. Today, it still operates, its lights still flashing twice every 30 seconds, still warning ships away from the rocks. But it does so without human presence, without the men who once kept vigil through the long nights. The mystery of what happened to Duckett, Marshall, and MacArthur remains unsolved and likely always will. But their disappearance serves as a reminder of just how dangerous the lighthouse keeper's profession could be. These men weren't just maintaining lights. They were living on the edge of disaster, in places where a single mistake, a single moment of bad luck, could mean death. And yet, despite the danger, despite the tragedies, despite everything we've discussed, men continued to volunteer for this work for another century. Because for all its hardships, lighthouse keeping was also a calling, a vocation, a way of life that meant something. The rhythm of the keepers. Let's talk about what daily life was actually like for a lighthouse keeper. Because beyond the occasional tragedy, beyond the dramatic storms and mysterious disappearances, there was routine. Day after day, week after week, month after month of carefully structured routine. And for many keepers, that routine was both the hardest part of the job and the thing that made it bearable. A typical day began early. The keeper who had been on watch during the previous night would wake the others and prepare breakfast. The Northern Lighthouse Board provided generous food rations. By 1873, each keeper was allowed a daily ration of a pound of meat, a pound of bread, 2 ounces each of oatmeal, barley, and butter, a quart of beer, and as many fresh vegetables as could be grown at the lighthouse. The vegetable gardens that many lighthouses maintained were jealously guarded. Keepers were even allowed to take their crops with them when they transferred to a new posting or sell them to the incoming keeper. After breakfast, the real work began. The lantern room had to be cleaned meticulously. The lenses made of precision ground glass arranged in concentric rings to focus the light beam had to be polished until they were absolutely spotless. Even a small smudge could reduce the light's range by miles, potentially leaving ships vulnerable in bad weather. The brass fittings had to be polished until they shone. The windows had to be cleaned inside and out, which at a rock station meant venturing onto the gallery that encircled the lantern room, often in strong winds that could literally blow you off the platform if you weren't careful. The mechanism that rotated the lens had to be wound. In earlier lighthouses, this was done with weights suspended in the tower's central shaft, like a massive grandfather clock. The keeper would wind the weights up to the top, and as they slowly descended, they would turn gears that rotated the lens assembly. Later lighthouses used clockwork mechanisms that still had to be wound regularly, but were more reliable and easier to maintain. Then there was oil to check, wicks to trim, reflectors to adjust, weather observations to record, tide measurements to note, passing ships to log. Every lighthouse kept detailed records of everything. Temperature, barometric pressure, wind direction and speed, visibility, cloud cover. The number and type of ships that passed within sight. Any unusual events, from equipment malfunctions to visiting supply boats to wildlife sightings. These logs had to be maintained with military precision because inspectors from the Northern Lighthouse Board would review them during their visits, and any sloppiness would be noted. The keepers worked in a rotation. At a 3-man station, one keeper would be the principal, responsible for overall management and decision-making. The other 2 would be assistants, though their specific ranks depended on experience. They would take turns with the watches, typically working in 4-hour shifts through the night. During the day, They would divide the maintenance tasks among themselves. But here's what people often don't understand about lighthouse keeping. For every hour of actual labor, there were 3 or 4 hours of simply being there, waiting, watching, making sure nothing went wrong. This was especially true at night, when the keeper on watch would sit in the lantern room, listening to the mechanism tick, making sure the light kept rotating, ready to respond if anything malfunctioned. For some men, this solitude was meditative. It gave them time to think, to read, to pursue hobbies. Many lighthouse keepers became self-taught experts in various subjects. They would study astronomy, meteorology, natural history. They would collect specimens of birds, plants, and marine life. They would keep detailed journals that went far beyond the official logs, recording their observations and thoughts. Others found the isolation unbearable. The silence, broken only by wind and waves, and the mechanical sounds of the lighthouse itself, could be oppressive. Time moved differently in a lighthouse. Days blurred together. Without the normal markers of social life, without weekends or holidays that meant anything, it was easy to lose track of what day it was. Some keepers dealt with this by imposing strict routines on themselves, creating structure where there was none. Others struggled with depression and loneliness that sometimes became acute. The Northern Lighthouse Board was aware of these challenges. They rotated keepers regularly to prevent anyone from spending too long in isolation. At rock stations, the typical rotation was 4 weeks on duty, 2 weeks ashore. At island stations, it might be 12 weeks on, 4 weeks off. Shore station keepers could go home at the end of each day, which made their lives considerably more normal. But even with these rotations, the strain could be significant. Keepers had to be psychologically resilient, able to cope with extended periods alone or with companions they might not particularly like. Because you didn't get to choose your colleagues. The board assigned keepers to stations based on availability and need, and you had to get along with whoever else happened to be posted there. Sometimes this worked out well. Keepers would form bonds that lasted their entire careers, friendships forged in shared isolation and shared responsibility. They would learn each other's habits, develop unspoken communication, work together with the kind of seamless coordination that only comes from spending months in close quarters. Other times, it didn't work out at all. Personality conflicts in a lighthouse could make life absolutely miserable. When you're stuck in a tower with someone you can't stand, with no escape, no privacy, no relief, tensions can escalate quickly. The board had procedures for dealing with this. Keepers could request transfers. Incompatible men would be separated. But the process took time, and in the meantime, you just had to endure. There were rules, of course, designed to minimize conflict. No alcohol on duty. No gambling. Religious services on Sundays were encouraged, but not mandatory. Keepers were expected to maintain harmonious relations with each other and to resolve disputes without violence or formal complaints whenever possible. The board preferred men who could handle problems themselves rather than constantly running to management. And for the most part, it worked. The majority of lighthouse keepers served their entire careers without serious incident. They did their jobs, kept the lights burning, and when they retired, they could look back with pride on decades of service. But there were exceptions. Stories of keepers who went mad from isolation. Keepers who became violent. Keepers who simply walked away one day, abandoning their posts and never coming back. One particularly strange case involved a keeper at Inchkeith Lighthouse in the Firth of Forth who became convinced that the lighthouse was haunted. He reported seeing shadowy figures moving through the building at night, hearing footsteps in empty rooms, feeling cold spots that had no natural explanation. His colleagues saw nothing unusual, but the keeper became so distressed that he eventually had to be reassigned. Whether he was genuinely experiencing something paranormal or suffering from isolation-induced hallucinations. Nobody could say. But the incident became part of lighthouse lore, one of many ghost stories that circulated among the keepers. The supernatural element has always been part of lighthouse culture. When you spend your nights in a tall tower surrounded by darkness and water, when the wind howls and the building creaks and groans, when you're far from other human beings and acutely aware of your vulnerability, it's natural for the mind to conjure ghosts. Many lighthouses were said to be haunted by former keepers who had died in service, still making their rounds, still tending to their duties, even in death. Were any of these stories true? That's impossible to say. What we do know is that lighthouse keepers took them seriously. They would pass stories from one generation to the next, adding details, embellishing perhaps, but maintaining a core narrative that gave these isolated structures a sense of history and personality. A haunted lighthouse wasn't necessarily a frightening place to these men. It was a lighthouse with character, with a story, with a connection to the past that made the keeper feel less alone. The Northern Lighthouse Board was officially skeptical of supernatural claims, but they didn't dismiss them entirely. They recognized that belief in ghosts, whether justified or not, could affect a keeper's performance and morale. If a man was genuinely afraid of his posting, he wouldn't do good work. So the board would sometimes accommodate transfer requests from keepers who claimed their lighthouses were haunted, even if they didn't publicly acknowledge the reasons. Families and sacrifice. Behind every lighthouse keeper was a family making sacrifices of their own. The wives who raised children essentially as single mothers for weeks or months at a time. The children who grew up with absent fathers, seeing them only during brief shore leaves. The entire support structure that made it possible for these men to spend so much time isolated in towers. Life as a lighthouse keeper's wife was not easy. You had to be comfortable with extended periods of uncertainty. When storms hit, you wouldn't know if your husband was safe. Communication from rock stations was impossible. Even from island stations, it could be sporadic. You might go weeks without hearing anything. And during that time, you'd have to manage the household, make decisions, deal with emergencies, all while wondering if the man you married was still alive. Mary Foulis, wife of keeper Robert Foulis, who served at various stations in the late 19th century, kept a diary that provides insight into what this life was like. She wrote about the constant anxiety, the relief when her husband's boat finally appeared after a long rotation, the immediate sadness when he had to leave again just as they were settling back into family life. She wrote about her children asking when Papa would come home and not understanding why it would be so long. She wrote about the financial strain because even though the salary was steady, it wasn't generous, and managing a household on it required careful planning. But she also wrote about the pride she felt in her husband's work, the knowledge that he was doing something important, something that saved lives. When ships passed safely in the night because of the light her husband tended, those were victories she could share in. The lighthouse keepers might have been the ones in the towers, but their families were partners in the mission. Children of lighthouse keepers often had unique childhoods. Those who grew up at shore or island stations had access to education and social interaction, though they were sometimes teased or set apart because their fathers had such an unusual occupation. But they also had opportunities that other working-class children didn't. The lighthouse compounds often had gardens, animals, space to play. The Northern Lighthouse Board's steady income meant these families weren't facing the constant threat of destitution that hung over so many laborers of that era. Some children of keepers went into the service themselves. It became a multi-generational tradition in certain families, with fathers training sons in the craft, passing down not just technical knowledge, but the entire culture of lighthouse keeping. These dynasty families were prized by the board because they produced keepers who understood the work at a deep, almost instinctive level. But other children couldn't wait to leave that life behind. They saw what it cost their fathers and their mothers, and they wanted something different. They would move to cities, take up trades or professions that kept them on solid ground, and leave the lighthouses behind. The Northern Lighthouse Board recognized the importance of families to the keepers' well-being. They provided housing, medical care, and educational opportunities for keepers' children. They gave families preference for employment in board-related work. When a keeper died in service, the board would provide a pension to the widow and sometimes help the children find employment. It wasn't charity. It was recognition that the families were part of the system, that supporting them was essential to maintaining the lighthouse service. This approach created loyalty. Keepers knew that if something happened to them, their families would be taken care of. That security allowed them to focus on their work, to take the risks that the job sometimes demanded, without constantly worrying about leaving their wives and children destitute. And it meant that lighthouse keeping, despite its hardships, remained an attractive profession for working-class men throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. The wives developed their own community as well. In port cities like Reef or Oban, where many lighthouse families lived when the keepers were on shore leave, the women would know each other, support each other, share information, and gossip. They understood what the others were going through in a way that outsiders couldn't. When a keeper was lost at sea or died in service, these women would rally around the widow, providing practical and emotional support. This network was crucial because the lifestyle was so unusual. How do you explain to someone who isn't part of the lighthouse community what it's like to be married to a man who's gone for months at a time, who might die in a storm you don't even know is happening? The keepers' wives understood because they were living it too. They formed bonds that often lasted decades, long after their husbands had retired or passed away. And when the keepers did come home, when they finished their rotations and had their shore leave, there was an adjustment period. The men had been living in a highly structured, isolated environment where they controlled nearly everything. Coming back to a household full of children, with all the chaos and noise and unpredictability that entails, could be jarring. Some keepers struggled to reconnect with their families, found it hard to relax, counted the days until they could return to the familiar order of the lighthouse. Others cherished every moment, tried to pack as much living as possible into their brief time ashore, took their children on outings, spent time with their wives, participated in community life with an intensity that came from knowing it would be temporary. And then the day would come when they had to leave again, and the whole cycle would start over. It was a strange way to live. Not quite military service, not quite merchant shipping, something uniquely its own. And it produced a particular kind of person, a man who could find satisfaction in solitude, who could take pride in work that was repetitive and often thankless, who could maintain discipline and focus for weeks without external supervision. The Northern Lighthouse Board didn't just hire employees, they recruited members of calling. The age of innovation. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, lighthouse technology evolved rapidly. The oil lamps that had been state-of-the-art when Robert Stevenson was building Bell Rock were replaced by more efficient systems. Paraffin vaporizing burners produced brighter, more consistent light. Then came incandescent mantles, which used a pressurized system to heat a delicate mesh that glowed with brilliant white light. But the Real Revolution came with electrification. In 1904, the Isle of May Lighthouse became the first in Scotland to be electrified. The difference was dramatic. Electric lights were brighter, more reliable, and required far less maintenance than oil lamps. They didn't need to be refilled every few hours. They didn't produce smoke that could smudge the lenses. They could be controlled with switches rather than requiring constant manual attention. For the keepers, electrification meant significant changes to their routine. Much of the time-consuming work of maintaining oil lamps disappeared. The watches became less intensive because the lights largely ran themselves. This should have made the job easier, and in some ways it did, but it also made it more boring. When the work was physically demanding, time passed. When all you had to do was monitor an electric lamp that rarely malfunctioned, the hours could drag. Radio communication arrived in the early 20th century, transforming the isolation of rock stations. Suddenly, keepers could communicate with the mainland, could call for help in emergencies, could receive weather warnings and news. The psychological impact was profound. Even if you were physically isolated, you were no longer cut off from the world. You could hear voices from civilization, maintain contact, feel connected. Some keepers embraced this change enthusiastically. Others resented it. Part of the appeal of lighthouse keeping for certain men was precisely the isolation, the separation from modern life, the simplicity of existence in a tower with just a few other people and clear responsibilities. Radio communication meant more contact with management, more immediate oversight, less autonomy. Some of the old keepers grumbled that it was ruining the profession. Fog signals evolved as well. Early lighthouses used bells or cannons to warn ships during conditions when the light itself might not be visible. These were crude and required manual operation. Later stations installed compressed air horns and eventually electronic systems that could detect fog automatically and activate the signal without human intervention. The characteristic sound of foghorns became as much a part of the lighthouse experience as the light itself, a mournful bellowing that could be heard for miles. Some of these signals were extraordinarily powerful. The foghorn at Cape Wrath Lighthouse, at Scotland's northwestern tip, was so loud that it could supposedly kill rabbits within a certain radius from the shock of the sound wave. Whether that's true or apocryphal, keepers reported that the noise during foggy conditions was genuinely painful, even inside the lighthouse with doors and windows closed. The lighthouse service also became more professional and regulated as the 20th century progressed. The Northern Lighthouse Board introduced formal training programs. New keepers would spend time as supernumeraries, essentially apprentices, learning from experienced men before being given their own postings. Examinations tested knowledge of optics, mechanics, meteorology, and first aid. Promotion depended not just on seniority, but on demonstrated competence. This professionalization improved safety and reliability, but also changed the culture. The lighthouse service became less like a brotherhood and more like any other government bureaucracy. There were procedures for everything, paperwork to file, regulations to follow. The casual informality of earlier eras gave way to official processes that had to be followed precisely. World War II brought lighthouse keepers into the conflict in unexpected ways. Many Scottish lighthouses were deliberately darkened during the war to prevent German bombers from using them for navigation. This went against everything the keepers had been trained to do. Their entire purpose was to keep the light burning, and now they were being ordered to extinguish it, to let the darkness return. Some found this deeply disturbing, a betrayal of their core mission. Other lighthouses were kept operational but dimmed, their ranges reduced. Keepers had to maintain blackout conditions in their living quarters, which was particularly challenging at rock stations where even a small amount of light could be visible for miles. And they had to watch as German aircraft flew overhead, knowing that if a lighthouse was hit by bombs, they were likely to die. Several Scottish lighthouses were attacked during the war. Rockhall Lighthouse, though not manned at the time, was destroyed. Others sustained damage from bombing or strafing. One keeper at a coastal lighthouse watched as a German bomber flew directly overhead, so close he could see the pilot's face. The plane was so low that the keeper thought it was going to hit the tower. Instead, it banked away at the last moment, either because the pilot chose not to attack a lighthouse or because he was already on another mission. After the war, the lighthouse service returned to normal operations, but the world had changed. Air travel was becoming routine. Electronic navigation aids like radar and eventually GPS were being developed. The absolute necessity of lighthouses, the crucial role they had played for 150 years, was beginning to diminish. Ships could navigate in ways that didn't depend solely on visual sighting of lights. The Northern Lighthouse Board recognized this shift. They began planning for a future where lighthouses would still exist, but wouldn't need permanent keepers. The technology had progressed to the point where lights could run themselves, monitored remotely, with technicians visiting periodically for maintenance rather than keepers living on site. Automation had begun, the beginning of the end. The first Scottish lighthouse to be automated was the Isle of May in 1989. It was chosen partly because it was a shore station, making the engineering work easier, and partly because it was a high-profile location where successful automation would demonstrate the viability of the program. The keepers were given advance notice. They would be reassigned to other stations, or, if they were close to retirement, given the option of early retirement with full benefits. For the men who had spent their careers at Isle of May, the automation was bittersweet. They understood the practical reasons. They knew that the technology had advanced to the point where their presence was less critical. But they also felt like they were being made obsolete, like their entire profession was being declared unnecessary. And they worried about what would happen to the lighthouses themselves without human eyes watching over them. Their concerns weren't entirely unfounded. Automated lighthouses were reliable, but they weren't perfect. Equipment malfunctioned. Weather damage went unnoticed. Small problems that a keeper would have fixed immediately could escalate into major failures. The lighthouses still needed maintenance, but now it happened on a schedule rather than in response to immediate need. If a light went out, it might stay out for days until the next scheduled visit from a technician. The board addressed these issues by installing sophisticated monitoring systems. Sensors would detect equipment failures and send alerts. Video cameras allowed remote monitoring. Technicians could make emergency visits when necessary. But it wasn't the same as having a keeper in residence, someone who knew the lighthouse intimately, who could feel in his bones when something wasn't quite right. The automation program accelerated through the 1990s. Lighthouse after lighthouse was converted. Keepers were relocated, retired, or in some cases retrained as the technicians who would maintain the automated systems. The job title changed from lighthouse keeper to attendant, reflecting the new reality that these weren't people who lived in lighthouses anymore, just workers who visited them. Rock stations were automated last because they were the most challenging. The equipment had to be extremely reliable, since reaching these lighthouses for repairs required good weather and careful planning. But eventually, the technology caught up. By the late 1990s, even the rock stations were being converted. Robert Livingstone was one of the last rock station keepers. He served at Dub Artac, a lighthouse built on a reef between Mull and Colonsay, a place so remote and wave-battered that it makes Bell Rock look accessible. Livingstone described Dub Artac as the loneliest and most isolated lighthouse in Scotland. The tower sits on a tiny rock that's barely visible at high tide, surrounded by seas that are rough even in good weather. During storms, waves would crash over the lantern room, 113 feet above the water. Living at Dub Artac meant complete isolation for weeks at a time. The relief boat could only land when seas were calm, which during winter might mean 2 months between visits. The keepers had to be completely self-sufficient, able to handle any emergency without help. Food, water, Everything had to be rationed carefully, because running out meant going without until the next boat could reach you. Livingstone spoke about the psychological challenges of spending Christmas at Dub Artak, knowing his family was celebrating without him, knowing he wouldn't see them for weeks yet. He talked about the storms that shook the building so violently that tools would fall off their hooks, that made sleep impossible. He described the peculiar silence after a storm passed, when the wind dropped, and suddenly you could hear your own thoughts again. But he also spoke about the pride he took in the work, about the satisfaction of keeping the light burning through the worst weather imaginable, about the knowledge that somewhere out there in the darkness, sailors were seeing his light and steering safely away from the reef. He never met any of these people, never received thanks or acknowledgement from the countless ships he helped guide to safety. But he knew they were there, and that was enough. When Dub Artak was automated in 1996, Livingstone was one of the last men to leave. He made a final inspection of the lighthouse, ensuring everything was in order, that the automated systems were functioning properly. Then he descended the spiral staircase for the last time, stepped into the bosun's chair, and was winched down to the waiting boat. As the boat pulled away, he looked back at the lighthouse, this tower that had been his home for so many rotations, where he had experienced some of the most intense and challenging moments of his life. The light was still burning, managed now by computers and sensors rather than human hands. It would continue burning, continue warning ships away from Dub Artak Reef. But the human element, the presence that had animated this structure for more than a century, was gone. Livingstone went on to work as an attendant, maintaining automated lighthouses. It was good work, important work, but it wasn't the same. The connection, the sense of being part of something larger than yourself, that was diminished. You visited lighthouses now rather than living in them. You fixed problems rather than preventing them. The craft had become a job. The last light. By 1997, only one-man lighthouse remained in Scotland, Flannan Isle South. This lighthouse, located on Flannan Isle midway between Orkney and Shetland, will be the last bastion of the traditional keeper's life. The man chosen to be the final principal keeper was Clifford Bain, a veteran with decades of experience at stations across Scotland. For Bain, the posting was both an honor and a melancholy assignment. He would be the one to close this chapter of maritime history. Flannan Isle South was automated on March 31st, 1998. The date had been set months in advance, giving Bain and his team time to prepare. They conducted their final inspections, ensured the automated systems were functioning perfectly, trained the attendants who would take over maintenance. The Northern Lighthouse Board organized a ceremony to mark the occasion, inviting former keepers, board officials, and local dignitaries. On the appointed day, Clifford Bain performed the traditional ritual one last time. He climbed to the lantern room as dusk fell and manually lit the light, even though it would switch to automatic operation at midnight. It was a symbolic gesture, a way of honoring all the keepers who had performed this task over the past 2 centuries. Then he descended to join the others for the ceremony. At midnight, as March 31st became April 1st, 1998, the automated system took over. The light continued to burn exactly as it had before, but now it was controlled by computers rather than human hands. Clifford Bain was no longer a lighthouse keeper. He was the last lighthouse keeper. And with that transition, a profession that had existed since 1786 came to an end. The media covered the event extensively. Newspapers ran stories about the passing of an era. Television crews filmed interviews with Bain and other former keepers, capturing their memories and reflections. There was genuine public interest in this moment, a recognition that something significant was disappearing from Scottish life. But the coverage also revealed how little most people understood about what lighthouse keeping had actually been like. Reporters asked romantic questions about loneliness and storms, expecting dramatic stories. And yes, those elements existed. But the keepers also talked about the routine, the daily maintenance, the satisfaction of a job well done. They talked about the camaraderie, the dark humor that developed among men living in close quarters. They talked about the small pleasures, a good meal, a calm sea, a book finished during a long watch. What they were describing was a life, not a romantic ideal. And that life was now over. The Northern Lighthouse Board handled the transition professionally. Keepers who wanted to continue working were retrained and employed as attendants. Those who were close to retirement were given generous packages. Nobody was simply abandoned. But there was no avoiding the fundamental reality. The career these men had devoted their lives to no longer existed in its traditional form. Some adapted well. They found satisfaction in the attendant role, appreciated the ability to go home every night, enjoyed having more time with their families. Others struggled. The routine of visiting lighthouses on a schedule, the lack of deep connection to a specific place, the bureaucratization of what had once been a calling, these changes were difficult. And then there were the lighthouses themselves. Over 200 structures scattered along Scotland's coasts and islands, most of them now operating without human presence. Some remained in excellent condition, maintained by regular visits from attendants. Others began to show signs of neglect. Small issues that a resident keeper would have addressed immediately were only discovered during scheduled inspections, sometimes after they had caused additional damage. The board insisted that automation made the lighthouses more reliable, not less. Their statistics showed that the lights went out less frequently than in the days of manned operation. Equipment failure rates decreased. Response times to problems, once the monitoring systems detected them, were faster than before. By every measurable metric, automated lighthouses perform better. But metrics can't capture everything. They can't capture the sense of presence that a lighthouse keeper provided, the knowledge that someone was there, watching, caring for the structure, serving as an embodied connection between the lighthouse and the community it served. When lighthouses were manned, they were part of the social fabric. Children would visit on school trips. Local people would stop by to chat with the keepers. The lighthouse was a living place, woven into the community's identity. Automated lighthouses are just buildings. Impressive buildings, historic buildings, important buildings. But buildings nonetheless, without the human element that made them meaningful. Let me tell you about something that happened in 2011. Fair Isle, the island where Clifford Bain had served as Scotland's last keeper, needed repair work done on the South Lighthouse. A team of attendants sailed out to the island to conduct the maintenance. When they arrived and opened the lighthouse, they found that water had been leaking in through the roof for months, possibly longer. The damage was extensive. Insulation was ruined. Wiring had corroded. The interior walls showed signs of mold. None of this had been detected by the monitoring systems because the systems only tracked the functioning of the light itself, not the condition of the building. If a keeper had been living there, the leak would have been noticed within days and repaired before it could cause serious damage. Instead, because nobody was checking regularly, because the automated systems gave no indication of a problem, the deterioration had gone on unchecked until it required major repairs. This is the kind of thing that happened repeatedly in the years after automation. Not catastrophic failures, but gradual degradation. Paint peeling because nobody was there to maintain it. Doors left unsecured by visiting technicians because there was no resident keeper to do a final check. Wildlife moving into unused rooms because the buildings were effectively abandoned. Vandalism at lighthouses that could be reached by determined trespassers because there was nobody there to prevent it. The Northern Lighthouse Board responded to these issues by increasing inspection frequency and establishing stricter maintenance schedules. But it was reactive rather than proactive. The intimate knowledge that keepers had possessed, the ability to detect problems through experience and intuition before they showed up in monitoring data, that was gone. But beyond the practical maintenance issues, there was a deeper loss. The lighthouse keeper had been a figure in Scottish culture for more than 2 centuries, a symbol of dedication, of steadfastness, of human presence in wild places. Children grew up with stories of lighthouse keepers braving storms to keep the lights burning. Novels and poems celebrated their isolation and perseverance. The image of a lone keeper in a tower had become part of Scotland's identity. When the profession ended, something cultural ended with it. Oh, the lighthouses remained. Many are now tourist attractions. You can visit them, climb the stairs, see the lantern rooms. The Northern Lighthouse Board has done commendable work preserving the historic structures and making them accessible to the public. But you're visiting monuments to a vanished way of life, not experiencing that life itself. Some former keepers have stayed involved with their old lighthouses as volunteers or tour guides. They share their memories with visitors, describe what it was like to live in these towers, keep the stories alive. But as the years pass, there are fewer of them. The men who served as keepers are aging. Every year, more of them die, taking their first-hand knowledge with them. In 2015, a group of former lighthouse keepers held a reunion at the Northern Lighthouse Board headquarters in Edinburgh. About 30 men attended, representing a small fraction of the thousands who had served over 2 centuries. They shared stories, looked at old photographs, reconnected with colleagues they hadn't seen in years. The mood was nostalgic, but also tinged with sadness. They were the survivors of an extinct profession, witnesses to a world that no longer existed. One keeper, who had served at multiple rock stations in the 1970s and 80s, gave an interview during the reunion. He talked about how the job had shaped him, how the discipline and self-reliance he learned had influenced every other aspect of his life. He spoke about the friends he'd made, the adventures he'd had, the challenges he'd overcome. And then, toward the end of the interview, he said something that stuck with the journalist who was covering the event. "People ask me if I miss it," the keeper said. "And I tell them yes, every day. Not because I want to go back to living in a lighthouse. I'm old now, I've got grandchildren, I like my comfortable life. But I miss knowing that I was part of something that mattered. I miss the feeling of keeping watch, of being the reason that light kept burning. I miss being needed. That sense of being needed, of serving a purpose larger than yourself. That's what lighthouse keeping provided. And when the profession ended, that disappeared. The lights still burn. Ships still navigate safely. But the human connection, the personal investment, the individual responsibility, that's gone. The ghosts in the towers. Walk through a Scottish lighthouse today, and you'll find it oddly empty. The equipment is still there, much of it. The lantern rooms still house the massive lenses, though many have been replaced with more efficient modern optics. The keepers' quarters are sometimes preserved as museums, with beds and furniture arranged to show how people lived. But there's an absence, a hollowness that comes from human absence. Some people claim the lighthouses are haunted now in a way they never were when keepers lived in them. Not by traditional ghosts, but by the weight of emptiness, the sense of abandonment. Buildings designed for human habitation, built specifically to house people whose purpose was to maintain the light, now standing empty except for occasional visits from technicians. There's something inherently sad about that. Local communities near automated lighthouses often report the same feeling. When the keepers were there, the lighthouse was part of the community's daily life. You would see the keepers in town, buy groceries from them, chat with their families. Children would grow up knowing the lighthouse was manned, that someone was always there keeping watch. Now, the lighthouses are just structures, important for navigation, but disconnected from the social fabric. Some islands that housed lighthouse keepers have struggled economically since automation. The keepers and their families were part of the population, contributing to the local economy, supporting shops and services. When they left, these small communities lost residents, lost income, lost the vitality that comes from human presence. A few islands that were already struggling with depopulation saw the removal of lighthouse keepers as the tipping point, the change that made it impossible for them to sustain themselves. Flannan Isle is an interesting case. The island has a population of about 50 people, and when Flannan Isle South Lighthouse was manned, the keepers and their families represented a significant percentage of that total. After automation, the island lost those residents. But Flannan Isle has survived, partly through tourism and partly through deliberate efforts to attract new residents. The lighthouse is now one of the island's tourist attractions, drawing visitors who want to see where Scotland's last keeper served. But other islands weren't so fortunate. Some have been effectively abandoned, their populations dwindling to zero or near zero. The lighthouses still operate, their automated systems faithfully performing their function. But they do so in isolation, beacons without witnesses, lights that burn for ships that are themselves increasingly automated. The younger generation of Scottish Islanders often has no direct memory of lighthouse keepers. If you're under 30, the profession ended before you were born or when you were too young to remember. The lighthouse keeper exists for you as a historical figure, like a blacksmith or a cooper, someone from the past whose job has been superseded by technology. And that's exactly what happened. The lighthouse keeper was rendered obsolete not because the work wasn't important, but because machines became capable of doing it more efficiently. This is a pattern that's playing out across many professions in the 21st century. Jobs that once required human presence, human judgment, human dedication are being automated. And we're told this is progress, that it frees humans from dangerous, repetitive, or unpleasant work. Which is true, as far as it goes. Lighthouse keeping was dangerous. It was repetitive. It demanded sacrifices from the keepers and their families. Nobody should romanticize that too much. But something is still lost. The satisfaction of craftsmanship, the pride of specialization, the sense of identity that comes from belonging to a distinct profession with its own culture and traditions. The younger generation doesn't have lighthouse keeper as an option. They can become technicians or engineers or managers. But they can't become keepers because that role no longer exists. And so the lighthouses stand, their lights still burning, still serving their purpose, but emptier somehow. Hollower, like bodies without souls. The legacy. Today. Thank you for spending this quiet moment with us. Whether you're listening from a warm bed, a lonely night shift, a long journey, or a silent room somewhere in the world, we're truly grateful to have you here. If this story kept you company tonight, let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. And if there are other stories you'd love to fall asleep to, different places, legends, or forgotten tales, feel free to share your wishes in the comments. If you'd like more calm nights and gentle stories like this, consider subscribing to Mystic Sleep Tales. New stories will always be waiting for you when the world grows quiet. Your presence, your words, and your quiet moments mean more than you know. Sleep peacefully, and we'll meet again in the next story. Crescent Moon.